I'm exceedingly delighted that there is so much interest again about Achaemenid Persia, maybe to begin with because of a number of publications. Two of them are to be attributed to Melanie Westwood herself. I think about going to show off your books, Melanie, die ägypto-persische Herrscher- und Herrschaftspräsentation in der Achaemenidenzeit. That is the first book, which was a wonderful book in the very German fashion, which means is delightfully well documented and a monumental work. And then most recently a book by our friend Henry Colburn, which has come out, Archaeology of Empire in Achaemenid Egypt. A number of works by my dear friend Agula Border, which I'm not presenting at the present. And obviously the most recent edited volume by Melanie Westwood and Paul Priestman about Udjahorresnet and his world, in which there are a number of wonderful articles by many of the panelists today present. So all of this has created obviously a lot of interest in Achaemenid Persia in that specific period. And it will, we are obviously, we hope to be en vogue, but we are not. It just happened that it was coincided with our own desire also to enter into Achaemenid Egypt, maybe because of some of the limitations also imposed on us at Center for Old Iranian Studies to go elsewhere. One important matter is, however, the discovery to what extent Egypt is defining also Achaemenid Persia, and to what extent it offers a different model of comprehension. First of all, it is one of the most, probably with Mesopotamia and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, one of the most developed entities that falls prey to the Achaemenid Empire, and the possibility of understanding the articulation of the Achaemenid religious policy in Egypt, the financial restructuring of the Temple Gemeinden, as well as everything that we want to think about the Achaemenids, how they really do manage other religions, or how do they integrate themselves into that religious landscape, and what is exactly the religious policy. This is obviously one of the prime examples, one of the important paradigms that can provide more elucidation of the matter. Obviously Mesopotamia, that is Babylon, and the Second Temple community has always been at the forefront of this investigation, but Egypt has been to some extent neglected in elucidating this matter. So obviously this is a very important matter for us Iranists altogether, interested in Achaemenid Egypt. Now, one more important matter to which I think in a recent article John Hyland also referred is the boundary of the empire, and to what extent is Egypt so consequential, substantial for the self-understanding of the Achaemenid Empire? Why do they keep going back there? It means they have been kicking out all the time. There are rebellions after rebellions, and they still persevere and want to go and basically have a foot in Egypt. It is not the same determination that you see maybe with respect to the Aegean, the Ionic coast, which is by far more immediate, or even Greece. Egypt seems to be an obsession. And if one looks back at the so-called cosmogonical map or presentations of Achaemenid Iran and beyond that of ancient Iranians, one can see indeed that the core of the empire is delimited by two rivers, that is in the mytho-epic conception of things, which is later transposed upon the reality of the Achaemenid topography. And those rivers are the boundaries of what the Persians consider to be basically the core of the empire. Those rivers, the western one is called in a Western Rangha, and we know that this term is well attested in the Achaemenid period by being the name applied to the Volga, Ra, at least by the Greek sources. But what we know from the later, more mature cosmogonical texts is that this river traversed the oceans. So the continuation of the Volga River could be, from the Persian perspective, actually the Nile River. And so for the Persians of old, to some extent, Egypt would fall into the fold of the core, a core constituent of the empire. So it would not be an accident ontologically, say, an accident that could be part or not part of the empire. It is a core constituent of the empire. And in that sense, it would make sense why they keep going back to Egypt, because their self-understanding of the empire encompasses Egypt as a main component. And also this desire to put stela everywhere, to demark basically the boundary of the empire, not only at the Suez, not only at the Volga, not only in the Crimean, in the Crimean Peninsula, but these are the waters that are delimiting the core of the empire, and Egypt and the Nile belong to that. So with all of this stated, it makes sense for us, obviously, to investigate and invest by far more energy in understanding Achaemenid Egypt from the perspective of ancient Iranian studies. And it is our hope that we can, in the future, build around the Pura Center a consortium, which would be led by my dear colleague, Marissa Stevens, and hopefully other colleagues at UCLA who have been exceedingly instrumental in creating this Persian and Egyptian dialogue, namely Kara Cooney, Jonathan Winneman, I would like to mention as well, and Willeke Windrich. And so with this, basically to re-enter now a new field, a new era of Persia and Egyptian interactions. So I think I have spoken by far more than I wanted. Marissa, please forgive me. It was just the first time I had nothing written, and it led me to basically divulge too much. So I would like then to now go back to Marissa for her to make further introductions, and I shall be muted for the rest of the time. Thank you so much.
I appreciate your enthusiasm. It's infectious, and I hope permeates the rest of this workshop. I don't have much to add to that, except to say that this entire workshop was really inspired by the edited volume, Udjahorresnet and His World, which was published in 2020. Melanie Voxmuth was the editor of that special edition of the JEEI journal. And Udjahorresnet is really the star of today's show. He was a career politician as well as a chief physician in Egypt's 26th and 27th dynasty. So he spanned the Saite period and then the Achaemenid period in Egypt, serving under 2 pharaohs of the 26th dynasty and 2 of the 27th dynasty. And it's really through his eyes that we are learning and interrogating and questioning a lot of what we know about this time period. And the goal of today's workshop is to delve deeper into those discussions and scholarly debates about the life and times of Udjahorresnet and what this means in both the Egyptian world and then the larger Achaemenid world. And I will place the link to that volume in the chat, so please take some time to check out that volume and all of the wonderful contributions that were included as part of that journal. So with that being said, I would like to turn things over to our first speaker of the day, Melanie Voxmuth. She is a university researcher and vice team leader of the Social Scientific Theories and Applications team at the Finnish Center of Excellence in Ancient Near Eastern Empires at the University of Helsinki. She started her academic career in 2007 as an assistant professor to the chair of Egyptology at the University of Basel, Switzerland, followed by engagements there as coordinator of the interdisciplinary and international degree courses in ancient world studies, as a Marie Heim-Voltken fellow for her research on Egyptians in Mesopotamia, and as a part-time lecturer for PhD courses on transcultural perspectives in ancient world studies. She has been a visiting scholar at the Leiden Institute for Area Studies and a guest curator at the Ancient Persian Museum, Amsterdam. Melanie Voxmuth studied Egyptology, ancient Near Eastern archaeology and philology, and to minor in extant prehistory, archaeological theory, museology, and ancient philosophy at the universities of Tübingen, Cambridge, Munich, and Vienna, where she graduated in 2002 with a double MA in Egyptology and ancient Near Eastern studies. She completed her PhD on the royal and non-royal Egypto-Persian display of the Achaemenid period at Basel in 2009 and received a double docentship in Egyptology and Ancient Near Eastern Studies from the University of Helsinki in 2019, based on her postdoctoral research on ancient cross-regional migration and cultural encounters in the Mediterranean and West Asian areas of connectivity in the 8th to 4th centuries BCE. As I mentioned, in 2018, she initiated a workshop project that underlied the 2020 publication, Udjahorresnet and His World, which triggered the panel workshop at hand today. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Foxmuth.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for your kind words and appreciation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've been very, very pleased by when learning about your initiative to do a kind of spin-off, a follow-up workshop, and to be able to assist a bit in selecting a small but representative and hopefully insightful panel of people. So it's really a pleasure to be here. My task for today is to give a basic introduction into the motivations and rationale behind this 2020 volume that triggered this workshop. So those who have actually read the volume will not learn much new from me, apart from perhaps a bit more background information, what led up to it. But for the others, the idea was that to introduce the volume and what motivated might be a good starting point for getting us into the mindset of future discussion. As has been already indicated, to quite some degree, the whole issue of trying to get closer to what Udjahorresnet means and meant for the ancient world in the late 6th century BCE was triggered by my PhD research, which originally included not only the display, the Egypto-Persian display of the rulers and the rulership in the Achaemenid period, but also the non-royal perspective. But for publishing it as a monograph, that was completely taken out. The non-royal aspects are partially published in several articles, including one in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, in which I more closely discussed the display, especially of the statue, the now Foro Vaticano of Udjahorresnet. But trying to get more at the dynamics that result in the fusion, the integration of Egypt into the Achaemenid Empire, it became more and more clear to me that we need to have a completely new, a much more nuanced look at that time period and of why Egypt needed to be included from the perspective of the Persians. And one of the key issues there was for me to actually follow three goals, really in a way the most major being to enhance basic awareness and appreciation within our academic field of ancient history, what major asset we actually have to share on the scope of wider world history. We actually have one of the very few figures who are not royal and are explicitly known by name, where we can pinpoint that they are instrumental for major diplomatic ventures on a global scale. So this contribution history to world diplomacy. The second level, also already mentioned in the basic introduction, is the much larger need, especially for the monuments and sources from Egypt, to become aware and to discuss much more nuancedly the complexity of the interpretation of the sources within the very wide interdisciplinary scope of Achaemenid studies. And the third one, to make a major contribution, hopefully also to Egyptology, where most of the discussion, the detailed analysis of Udjahorresnet and his monuments have been traditionally taking place, but also this has been, until a decade ago, or perhaps even to some degree until now, been limited to certain aspects. So if we look more closely, what can we actually offer as a field for really large diachronic shares, that with the Achaemenid Empire and with Udjahorresnet being an instrumental figure in that, we actually made it into the book of Guinness World Records. The Achaemenid Empire is for at least a decade now noted there as the largest empire by percentage of world population. It's the first ancient Eastern empire of rather global, or at least of hitherto unknown extension. And with the integration of Egypt, we have the marriage of the largest and of the most enduring kingship. And in my perspective, that's actually the key reason why the Persian Empire was so interested in keeping and in getting that empire, that kingdom, and keeping it, because they, as a newly created, newly set up empire that extremely fast expanded across previously unknown dimensions, they kind of needed, or maybe felt also very explicitly, the need of rooting their kinship in historical depth. At least that's what one can very clearly see in the way Egyptian display is included into the Persian kingship design and gets then transmitted later on. And as already mentioned, the fourth really major point that we can offer is that we actually do know by name one of the non-royal key negotiators of this fusion. For the second aspect, the enhancing appreciation of the complexity of source interpretation within Achaemenid studies, beyond the core area of Persia, beyond the Levant, really including as an integral part the Egyptian sources. I want to showcase three major aspects concerning Udjahorresnet. The one that he is actually from a powerful local family with access in the 26th dynasty to court, to the central administration, and to high priestly circles. Then in the 27th dynasty, he becomes actually a member of the imperial court, both in Egypt and in Persia. And he is obviously able to correctly gauge and harness cross-regional dynamics of politics, both of warfare and of diplomacy, in order to make this fusion feasible and maintainable. So this fusion of this largest and of the most durable kingship at the time that is available. And for Egyptology, my key issue was, and still is, to really step up that the monuments by Udjahorresnet, as well as by his contemporaries, but very, very explicitly the inscribed monuments of Udjahorresnet, that they are not only a philological source, but actually also, if not primarily, a historical and an epigraphic source. And then in the few instances where we had before, let's say 2010, discussion of his sources and of him as a historical figure, to really make that shift, that he is not only and maybe not mainly a collaborator, a traitor, which is what has been very strongly presented beforehand, but that he is at least also a major facilitator for long-term dissemination of Egyptian culture. So the question is whether without him and without that fusion, Egyptian culture would actually have had a chance to survive as long as it did, and it certainly wouldn't have been circulated and spread across such a large region as after that, even though this goes hand in hand with less strict traditional canonical development within the culture, but it's a more open one. But in my view, one really has to discuss the various shades of gray between those two extremes of understanding. This is something that I would love to do and would love to be able to do also on my own, but it's simply beyond my capacities. So this needs to be done by really a major group of people, because it includes so many different specialized expertise that it's impossible for a single person to do. So I set out to think about very specific, rather closed circle workshop with the aim not mainly to share ideas, but very, very explicitly to create a different kind of publication on Udjahorresnet, which is not the standard proceedings of a workshop, but the idea was really to do a multi-author, more monograph, like that's an absurdity in itself, but you know what I mean. So it's not a separate volume, but the idea was that it's really an integral part, monograph, an integral volume with handbook function for history of diplomacy, for Achaemenid studies, and for Egyptology. And the idea being that it should span the 4 major topic areas of Udjahorresnet's personal life, with focus on the family connections and the further social context, then his professional functions under all 4 kings, and both in the Egyptian and in the Persian/imperial context, and also the political and social implications of his professions and titles. Then to look at him as a diplomatic figure and his attitudes and dealings with his fellow Egyptians, his fellow Persians, and within a wider cross-regional political context. And finally, to look at him as a narrative mediator, as a historiographer, as a narrator, and to bind into this the later reception, and to approach this really from a variety of different perspectives. So to include the various ancient Near Eastern studies, ancient history, biblical studies, Greek philology, international relations, the different strands of Egyptology and of history of medicine. The latter I managed to do for the workshop. For the former, I only managed to achieve part of it, and that even though I had 2 really motivated, interested, early on coming in co-organizers of that workshop, which was most prominently Alexander Schütze, who is here also today, at least virtually. It's really a pity that we can't meet in person, who, when I've asked him to participate in the workshop, made it very obvious that, he's really in for this project, and gave it a completely different life. And it was then actually also held in Munich at the Institute where he was there. And we had Alexander Schwab from Greek philology in Munich joining as organizers. But all in all, the result of the workshop was that it's a really important aim to do more handbook-like, a different kind of presentation, of more complex presentation, but that it's currently really unfeasible. And on the one hand, due to the time constraints of, on the one hand, the participants of the workshop, but also further experts, but also because such a handbook would need, in at least quite some areas, more fundamental research. So this decision was taken to skip the monograph idea or this handbook idea in favor of faster publication of the different strands, both from within the workshop, but also of with an open call for papers in order to add on and elaborate at least slightly aspects that have not been closely studied in the workshop, and to think of it more in the form of an elaborate open access teaser for further research. And I'm, in hindsight, very glad that we did it, even though I was originally a bit disappointed that we couldn't get it in a way the step further, but it really worked as today's venture shows. The strategy has been successful. It created initiatives for future collaboration, for future research, including this follow-up workshop, for which I'm very grateful and appreciative that the research is going on there. And I would just like to briefly summarize what I see as major achievements published in the volume in the Journal of Ancient Egyptian Interconnections, 26th volume, Udjahorresnet and His World. And we have there also, again, 4 major strands, lines of achievements that I would like to highlight. One is that in the volume, it was possible to publish some really fundamental corrections of what has been, previous kind of consensus. The one is by Cristina Ruggiero, who has been studying the archival documentation of acquisition of the now Foro Vaticano until it finally got into the current exhibition, and she could actually follow back the transport and selling the sales of the now Foro back from Italy, back from the Aegean Islands to a sales document in modern Turkey and modern Izmir, former Smyrna, where the now Foro was bought in 1772. So it definitely has not been transferred to Italy in antiquity, as has been so far assumed, but is really transported, at least from Turkey. We don't know when it came to Turkey, but it was transferred from the Turkish west coast to Italy in the 1770s, with the sales received from 1772 in Smyrna, and 1778 it was then in the final exhibition, that was the first final exhibition in Rome. And it did not come to Italy as part of the Villa Hadriana, as can be often read. A second major fundamental correction, about which we will hear more also today, concerns the tomb of Udjahorresnet, that has long been thought of, discussed as enigmatic, and for which Greta and Ladislav will present today the evidence, what needs to be thought of there. And Nenad Markovic actually finally has been able to provide Udjahorresnet with a family. So he has been long-term just seen as an individual, and we were, as a person with no closer known connections except the mother and father mentioned directly on the now Foro Vaticano, but he was able to come up with quite a number of other family relations. The second major aspect of major achievements are major historical recontextualization of the Persian Udjahorresnet. Once more, we will hear about some of them from Alexander Schütze. He and Nenad Markovic both rooted Udjahorresnet in and his personal and professional development in the 26th dynasty, something that has been essentially ignored, or at least pushed, marginalized in our field, and really made an effort to push this background, this historical personal background, to the fore. Then we have 2 papers by Henry Colburn and Francesco Lopez, the localization of Udjahorresnet, especially also in the imperial court in Persia, and to some degree also in the personal royal needs to step up to advance medical knowledge and practices. And by myself, it's a paper which focuses on the commemoration strategies by Udjahorresnet via a diversified statue program that actually resulted in his continued reverence in Memphis, at least until the 4th century BCE. The third major achievement catalog concerns Udjahorresnet as a political player, where we have by Alex Aisawi a paper that takes terms and concepts from the modern study field of international relations and edits them and presents them in a way that they can be used for analyzing individual agency in cross-regional policy dynamics, also in the time of Udjahorresnet or in other periods of ancient history. And then we have by Marissa Stevens and also by Ivan Ladinin a focus on the religious strategies explicitly employed for ensuring or justifying Persian authority in Egypt, and by Francis Johannes and Alison McCoskey, 2 papers with a comparative perspective, both from a top-down and from a bottom-up, or focusing on top-down and bottom-up strategies employed under Cambyses II in Babylonia and in the aftermath of Alexander III, usually better known as the Great, in Egypt, where the focus is on local resilience and resistance. And today we luckily have there, in addition, and with a different focus, the paper by Uzume Weinsma, really focusing and taking up the issue of rebellions and of local resistance from a even more nuanced and more spread out perspective. And largely we have especially one paper on which really focused on outlook on the future challenges, or more correctly actually took up the original main hope I had to do a joint commentary and joint new edition on the inscription, especially of the now for Vaticano, from a cross-regional and thus a cross-disciplinary perspective. And Reinhold Dichter made the start for that by presenting the available Greek historiographical evidence for events and concepts as far as they are mentioned in the inscription. And to some degree, we started as a workshop group to highlight more the design of the inscription, which is an epigraphic multi-surface design that is typical for Egyptian statues, and which means that it's not to be read, and you don't need to think about in which order the different surfaces can be read, but they are separate surfaces that, depending on where you stand as a reader, you can then read, and they are very explicitly in most Egyptian monuments and very strongly also in the statue of Udjahorresnet. They have clear topics that are presented within the iconographical framework of the statue. And though this is actually quite a bundle of important new research there, we still miss at least 3 major aspects, where some of which we at least get teasers today. I'm very glad to hear and to learn about. One is a much more detailed historical reanalysis of the local political and social dynamics in the 27th dynasty in Egypt, and then a much more widespread comparative analysis of local and imperial strategies of resilience and authority assertion, and not only in Egypt and in Babylonia, but really looking throughout the Persian Empire. Where do we can find individuals who are in this position of needing to come to terms with their own perspectives and the imperial and the other local perspectives, and provide input and possibly far-reaching input and thoughts, reflections on how to deal with the current situation of between local resilience and imperial integration. And the last one would be a much more nuanced discussion of diverse attitudes and handlings of this situation, especially also locally between different areas, between different social groups, between different strata of society, between different villages, depending on how the individual experienced that change, because it makes a huge difference whether you experienced the conquest by being a soldier or by not being a soldier or having no connection, no family member in there, or by belonging to a group that actually profits from this conquest or not. And this is something that still hasn't been studied in very much detail, and especially not in the consequence that has for then passing on this experience and for commemorating different perspectives of what the Persian conquests of Egypt or of wherever in the Persian Empire meant locally and for the further transmission. And as far as I see, this is something which we will only minimally look at today, but hopefully this new center or this new focus then of the Pour Vote Center will be able to highlight and advance these questions as well. And with this, I would like once more very much to thank Marissa Stevens for organizing, for initiating this workshop, and for giving us all the possibility to share new research and to discuss how to go on about our research on the Achaemenids, on Achaemenid Persia, on Achaemenid Egypt within the Persian Empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. With that, I would like to turn things over to Zuma Weinsma. She studied classics and ancient civilizations at Leiden University and received her MA degree in 2016. She is currently a PhD candidate at Leiden within the ERC project Persia and Babylon, creating a new context for understanding the emergence of the First World Empire. Her PhD project focuses on several episodes of Babylonian and Egyptian armed resistance against the rule of the Achaemenid kings. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Azuma.
So thank you, Marissa, for that lovely introduction, and also for inviting me to participate in this workshop. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the lectures and discussions that will follow. I'm personally, yes, finally. So I've been invited today to talk about Udjahorresnet in relation to the Bizitun crisis in Egypt. So the first Egyptian rebellion against Persian rule in 522-21 BC, or at least the first rebellion for which we have decent evidence. And I assume all of you know the Bizitun crisis, or at least familiar with it, so I'll only give a brief summary of the relevant events here. The Bizitun crisis was a period of political turmoil in the Persian Empire that began in the spring of 522 BC, so about 4 years after Cambyses conquered Egypt in 526 BC. Specifically, this period began when a man called Bardia, who claimed to be a brother of Cambyses, claimed the Persian throne for himself. And this Bardia then appears to have ruled the Persian Empire for several months in 522 BC. Now Cambyses, who had conquered Egypt, appears to have resided in Egypt up until that point, and he passed away somewhere around this time in still rather unknown circumstances. So Bardia was on the throne, but in September 522 BC, a man called Darius and several others accused this Bardia of being a fraud, of being an illegitimate king, and they executed him and claimed the Persian throne for themselves. And this is, of course, when Darius I became king of the Persian Empire in about September, October 522 BC. This is also the time that the situation appears to have escalated. So the moment that Darius claimed the throne, there were apparently multiple regions of the empire, mostly in the central and eastern parts of the empire, but not necessarily limited to that, that rebelled against his reign and tried to reclaim the independence they had enjoyed before the Persian Empire came into existence. So we hear of rebellions in Babylonia, for example, in Elam, in Media, in Persia, and in many other regions as well. And among these regions, Egypt also features. So around the turn of 522 to 521 BC, somewhere in the months of December, January, February, we hear of a rebellion in Egypt, the province that had most recently been conquered. Now, this rebellion in Egypt and the Byzantine crisis at large must have been one of the most significant political events that occurred during the career of the man that we are talking about today, of Udjahorresnet, aside, of course, from the Persian conquest of Egypt itself. So Udjahorresnet lived through these events. He must have been affected by them to some extent. But the autobiographical text on his statue appears to be silent about the entire episode. So the text, of course, talks about the transition from Saite to Persian rule in Egypt, about Cambyses' conquest, and about Udjahorresnet's relationship to the Persian kings Cambyses and Darius I. But it does not mention the period of rebellion that had occurred between that, or, for example, the reign of Bardia, whom we know was recognized as king in some regions of the empire in 522 BC, notably in Babylonia, for example, where several cuneiform tablets are dated to Bardia's reign. Now, the only possible indication of the Byzantine crisis on the statue of Udjahorresnet are two passages which talk rather vaguely about disaster in the land. So Udjahorresnet would have saved the people of Saite, his hometown in the delta, from the very great disaster which befell in the entire land. But as has been remarked multiple times over the years, the rather vagueness of this passage allows for multiple interpretations. So the disaster has been connected to the Persian conquest of Egypt, and it has been connected to the Byzantine crisis, but it could also be interpreted as a more general statement, where Udjahorresnet simply claims to be the better man who will save the people in any kind of trouble. So this specific disaster can unfortunately not be directly translated to a specific political event. Now, the fact that Udjahorresnet appears to have consciously omitted at least explicit references to the Byzantine crisis on his statue does not mean, of course, that the events were not important, either to him or in Egypt more generally. So in order to better understand the impact that these events actually had in the Nile Valley in this time period, and to contextualize Udjahorresnet's career within that, what I'd like to do in the coming 10 to 15 minutes or so is as follows. So first, we'll look at the sources that we currently have that can be used to study the Byzantine crisis in Egypt. And I'll focus here in particular on the Egyptian sources that are available that document the Egyptian rebellion of 522-21 BC. And the second thing that we will look at is the extent to which these Egyptian sources tell us something, anything about the people who were involved in this rebellion. So the individuals who recognized an Egyptian rebel king in 522-21 BC, rather than the reign of the new Persian king, Darius I. Now, in light of the time, I, of course, won't be able to elaborate on each and every detail or issue, This will really be an introduction. But of course, if you have any questions or comments about it at the end, they are certainly most welcome. So let's begin at the beginning. What are the sources that we presently have for the impact of the Byzantine crisis in Egypt? Now, in very general terms, we can divide the sources into three different categories. We have Persian royal inscriptions, Greco-Roman narrative texts, and contemporary Egyptian texts. And each of these sources sort of offers us a slightly different perspective on the events in question. Now, the example of the Persian royal inscriptions, the example is, of course, the Byzantine inscription. This large trilingual inscription on the rocks of Mount Byzantine near modern-day Kermanshah in southwestern Iran, and its accompanying monumental relief were commissioned by Darius I in the early years of his reign to commemorate what had happened in 522 BC and the years that followed. And it was, of course, specifically meant to propagate his version of events, in which he is portrayed as the legitimate king of the empire, and all others who claimed local autonomy are sort of reduced to liars, liar kings. So the whole story that I just told about Bardia and Darius claiming the throne and the rebellions that followed primarily stem from this one inscription. This is really the foundational text to work with for this period. Now, in terms of studying Egypt, it is important to note that the Byzantine inscription mentions Egypt 4 times in 3 different contexts. So once Egypt is simply mentioned as a satrapy, as one of the many countries that Darius claimed rule over as king of the Persian Empire. Twice, Egypt is mentioned as the country to which Cambyses had gone. So this is often understood as a sort of oblique reference to Cambyses' conquest of Egypt in 526 BC. And the inscription claims that after Cambyses had gone to Egypt, the people of the empire became disloyal. So that is sort of where the narrative of Bardia's rebellion begins, by the departure of Cambyses from Persia. And once Egypt is mentioned as one of several countries that rebelled while Darius was in Babylon at the turn of 522-21 BC. So this would be paragraph 21 in the Old Persian version. So the Old Persian text here is illegible at this point. So the reference to Egypt can be found in the Elamite and Babylonian versions of the text. Now, other than that, other than these mentions, Egypt is not mentioned again. So we do not hear how or when the rebellion in Egypt was actually defeated. And this stands in contrast with several of the other rebellions that are described in the remainder of the Byzantine inscription. So we hear, for example, about battles and executions and prisoners of war in Babylonia and Media, but further events about what happened in Egypt are omitted. And the significance of that silence in the Byzantine inscription still remains a point of discussion. Now, the second set of texts that can be used to study the Egyptian rebellion, and I'll be brief here, are Greco-Roman narrative texts. So I'll just mention the 2 most important passages that can be found. These are on rhetoric by Aristotle in the 4th century BC, and the Stratagems by Podianus, 2nd century AD author. Now, both of these texts, much later, of course, in the events they describe, refer to an Egyptian rebellion, Egyptian resistance or unrest in the early reign of Darius. And unlike the Byzantine inscription, both of these texts specifically talk about a Persian invasion of Egypt. So here we have the idea that Darius really had to invade Egypt to reconquer the country and subdue the unrest in the wake of what happened in 522 BC. And the third set of sources, the Egyptian texts, are the only sources that are actually contemporary with the period under discussion. So here we're talking about contemporary monuments, for example, or administrative and legal documents from certain archives that are dated to specific kings. And these sources can therefore show us when a particular king was or wasn't recognized in the Nile Valley in 522 BC and the years that followed. Now, for a long time, the only Egyptian texts at our disposal in this regard were actually texts dated to Persian kings. So, for example, from a demotic archive in Ashud, we have texts that show that Cambyses was recognized as a pharaoh of Egypt until at least the spring of 522 BC, so about the time that the BC tomb crisis would have begun. Several years after that, we find texts dated to Darius. So Darius was recognized in Egypt, possibly in his third year, but that is uncertain. But he was certainly recognized in Egypt from his fourth year onwards, so from 518 BC. And the years between that are not documented in terms of Persian kings, at least. So at the very least, these sources give us some chronological parameters for the Egyptian rebellion. The rebellion would have lasted from 522-21 BC, as the Byzantine inscription claims, to about 519, 518 BC at the latest. What they don't show us, of course, is what this rebellion would have looked like on the ground. They don't give us any concrete information on the events in between and what kind of rebel king, for example, we are talking about. Now, fortunately, that changed in 1972. So in 1972, Jean Yoyot identified several Egyptian sources that were mostly already published, but dated to another time period, which mentioned a pharaoh called Pedubastis Seher-Ibra, Seher-Ibra being the throne name of this king. And these sources are specifically a scarab. The base of the scarab is inscribed with the king's name. So we have Pedubastis and Seher-Ibra here. We have two fragments of a wooden shrine, which was originally inlaid with glass, which again bear the names of the king. Here it's not visible, but this is also Pedubastis Seher-Ibra inscribed on that. And there were two seal impressions on clay, which would have been originally attached to papyri. And again, of course, the inscriptions of the seal impression mention the throne name of this king, Seher-Ibra. Now, this king, Pedubastis Seher-Ibra, is not known from any Egyptian king list. He's rather an obscure figure in that regard. But the artifacts from his reign show notable similarities with artifacts from the reign of Amasis on the one hand, and with Darius I on the other. So based on these similarities with the artifacts, Jean Yoyot proposed to date Pedubastis Seher-Ibra to the late 6th century BC. And of course, if this king ruled in the late 6th century BC, the most plausible political context for his reign is the BC tomb crisis. This is the one period in this time span where we know that an Egyptian rebellion took place, and where we also know that there were plenty of other local kings in ancient Western Asia who were claiming throne names for themselves and claiming local autonomy in their countries. Now, recently, only a few years ago, in 2014, this corpus that can be attributed to the reign of the rebel king Pedubastis Seher-Ibra was significantly expanded. So excavations in the southern oasis in the western desert of Egypt have unearthed several temple blocks that again featured his birth and throne name. And I'm only showing 3 blocks here, but about 6 of them have been identified. And it seems that these blocks once belonged to a chapel which was built and dedicated to the Egyptian god Thoth at the site of Haida in the Dakhla oasis, so a site where several kings of the Saite dynasty and possibly also later Darius I also left their names behind. So these objects are presently the corpus of Egyptian sources that we can work with in order to study the BC tomb crisis in Egypt. Now, what can these sources tell us about the situation in Egypt from 522-21 BC onwards? What can they add to the information provided by the BC tomb inscription and Greco-Roman sources? Well, the first thing that should really be highlighted is the issue of where the rebellion came from. So it was originally suggested that Pedubastis Ibra may have come from the delta of Egypt, from the north, just like some of the later rebel kings of Persian period Egypt. Egypt rebelled multiple times, and some of the later rebel kings also came from the delta. And specifically, it was suggested that Sarah Ibra may have come from Bubastis, as his name is Paddy Bastet, the one who is given by Bastet. Now, with the finds from Amhida, from the Western Desert, it is actually much more plausible that the rebellion would actually have begun in the south of Egypt. As Olaf Kaper has argued, the fact that we find part of a temple built in Amhida, of all places, in this periphery, suggests that Sarah Ibra had some significant connection to that region in particular, and that this may actually have been his primary power base, from which he would then have conquered or spread to other parts in Egypt. Now, we do not know, and this is an important point, we do not know to what extent the rebellion was recognized in all of Egypt by all or most Egyptians. We just simply do not have the sources to make such generalized statements. But the sources from Sarah Ibra's reign, which we do have, indicate that he was at least recognized in Amhida, of course, but also in a much more northern part of the country, in the area of Heracleopolis, and possibly also in the area of Memphis to the north. Now, how do we know that? That brings us back to one of these seal impressions of Sarah Ibra's reign that I've already introduced. This seal impression has an inscription on it, of course, in hieroglyphs. And according to the inscription on it, the original seal which made the impression belonged to a treasurer, a merchatem in Egyptian, who was called Psamtik. And this Psamtik, by virtue of the cartouche of Sarah Ibra, apparently served under the reign of this rebel king, Pedubastis Sarah Ibra. Now, aside from the temple blocks of Amhida, this seal impression, Psamtik seal impression, is actually the only source from Sarah Ibra's reign which has a recorded provenance. Namely, it was found in the early 20th century by William Flinders Petrie in the rubbish of the Meidum Pyramid. No other significant archaeological context was given, unfortunately. What is important is that this seal impression was not found alone. It was in fact found together with another seal impression, which doesn't have a king's name, and of course with 3 Demotic papyri. Now, these papyri were first published in 2004, so many years after the seal impression was already known, and they've been recently republished in 2015. And here we have an example of one of the better preserved papyri from the Meidum Pyramid. Now, what is interesting about these papyri that were found there is that they turn out to be letters regarding land in the nome of Heracleopolis. So their find in Meidum appears to be secondary. Their intended destination was Heracleopolis. So in this letter, for example, we hear that an official called the treasurer, the merchatem, orders another person to give specific amounts of land to 5 different individuals in the area of Heracleopolis. And it's also interesting to note that among these 5 people who were to receive land, there were 3 Hermotybians. And these are a type of Egyptian soldier. And what is also interesting is that this papyrus, as well as one of the other 3 that is sufficiently legible, was written in regnal year 1 of a king whose name is not mentioned. Now, not identifying the name of a king was actually very common in letters. That happens all the time, which is of course a shame for us as historians, but we're dealing here most probably with the first regnal year of Petubas's Ser Ibra. And the reasons in favor of that identification are at least threefold. So first, these papyri from the Maiden Pyramid have been paleographically dated to the reign of Amasis Udjahorresnet I. So they were written somewhere in the late Saite to early Persian period in Egypt, which of course fits the time span. Second, the seal impression, which features the throne name of Ser Ibra, was found on the letter of which I just showed the translation. So that seal sealed this particular document. And the sender of this letter, the one who ordered the distribution of lands to, among others, the soldiers, appears to be identical with the owner of this seal, as one would also expect, of course. So as I already mentioned, the person who sent the letter to Heracleopolis was a treasurer, a merchatem, and the owner of the seal, Psamtik, bore that very same title. So we're dealing probably here with one individual. Now, if we accept that identification, then the letter itself can be dated to 5 April 521 BC. So the Egyptian date formula is the 6th of Choyak, year 1, 5 April 521 BC. So not too long after the Egyptian rebellion had begun, according to the Bizitun inscription. And the other letter, I must say, which preserves a legible date, was written shortly hereafter on the 16th of April. Now, at the moment, these letters and the seal impressions of Ser Ibra's reign are the only sources which we have that give some indication of the Egyptian individuals who actually fell under the authority of the rebel king Petubas's Ser Ibra. And who therefore may have actively supported or recognized his reign, rather than the reign of the new Persian king Darius I. In light of that, it is unfortunate that we know not much else about them other than what is preserved in these few sources. So there are no additional sources such as archival material, Serapean stelae, or statues, which can at present be connected to these individuals. The only possible exception, and that is an important exception in this regard, is Psamtik, the treasurer. So as was already suggested long ago by Yoyot, a Saite Persian shaft tomb near Memphis, which was built for a treasurer called Psamtik, can possibly be connected with the Psamtik that we have here, the Psamtik who actually served under the reign of Petubas's Ser Ibra. But that is the exception rather than the rule. Now, this general dearth of sources on Egyptians who recognized the reign of Petubas's Ser Ibra, of course, also means that we don't know what their position was, for example, in the reigns of Amasis, Psamtik III, or Cambyses. We also don't know what their fate was under the reign of Darius I, so whether they continued to have flourishing careers after the Bizitun crisis, when Petubas's Ser Ibra was defeated, and when Egypt was reconquered and reintegrated into the Persian Empire. But having said that, however elusive these sources are at present, they may at the very least serve as a reminder that some Egyptian soldiers, the Hermotybians in Heracleopolis, and some Egyptian officials of high rank, and I'm specifically thinking about Psamtik, the treasurer here, also with the shaft tomb near Memphis, like Udjahorresnet had, chose to recognize a rebel king in 521 BC, rather than the reign of the new Persian king Darius. And at the very least, this also raises the question what an official like Udjahorresnet was doing, and where he was, and whose reign he recognized during those crucial years from 522 to 518 BC, and of course how that would have impacted his career under the reign of Darius I. And I'll keep it to that. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments that you may have.
Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Alexander Schutze, who holds a PhD degree in Egyptology from the University of Leipzig. Since 2015, he has served as an academic officer at the Institute for Egyptology and Coptic Studies at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Prior to this appointment, he held a postdoctoral research fellow position at the graduate school Archaeology of Pre-Modern Economics at the universities of Cologne and Bonn. He has also served as a full-time lecturer and study course coordinator at the Institute for Egyptology of LMU Munich, and has also worked on the Alte Ägyptische Wörterbuch project based at Leipzig and the online database project Trismegistos. He also has excavation experience working in the universities of Munich and Cairo at the site of Tuna el-Gebel in Egypt. So with that, Professor Schutze, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to join this workshop with a contribution on Udjahorresnet and the 26th dynasty. We already heard a lot about at least one particular official of the 26th dynasty, the treasurer Psamtik, and I will continue with such officials in my talk. For the sake of keeping the time schedule and also for keeping some kind of structure of my paper, I will just read it, which is maybe not the best way of presentation, but as a kind of recompense, I brought a lot of statues with me, which will give you some kind of visual aids to understand some lines of the officialdom and political history of the 26th dynasty. So Udjahorresnet and the 26th dynasty. The biographical inscription on the now Foro Vaticano of Udjahorresnet is undoubtedly a unique historical document on the Persian conquest of Egypt, as well as on Egypt's first years as a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The historical significance of Udjahorresnet's biographical inscription had been widely appreciated and explored in all its facets, most recently in the edited volume Udjahorresnet and His World, which inspired today's event. Udjahorresnet, however, had a prehistory that takes its starting point in the late 26th dynasty. In many respects, he can be seen as a final representative of an official elite that emerged during the Saite period and came to an more or less abrupt end with the Persian conquest of Egypt. In this talk, I would like to briefly outline this previous life of Udjahorresnet and show how this official is not only a crown witness for the early Persian period in Egypt, but also provides important insights into Egyptian officialdom in the late 26th dynasty, whose development is closely intertwined with the political history of Egypt on the eve of the Persian conquest. In this regard, not only the biographical inscription of Udjahorresnet plays a role, but also his visual representation as a representative of an Egyptian courtly elite, which found its expression in the case of his Nauforic statue, but also his monumental shaft tomb at Abu Sir. But let's start with the well-known Naufo Vaticano. The clearest reference to Udjahorresnet's career before the Persian conquest of Egypt is to be found on the right side on the statue's inscribed robe, which reads as follows. The one honored by knights the great, the mother of the god, and by the gods of size, the prince, count, royal seal bearer, sole companion, true king's acquaintance, whom he loves, the scribe, inspector of the council scribes, overseer of the scribes of the great outer hall, director of the palace, overseer of the royal Achaemenid vessels under the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Achaemenid, overseer of the royal Achaemenid vessels under the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ankare, Udjahorresnet. Udjahorresnet was thus head of the royal Achaemenid ships of the pharaohs Amasis and Psametic III. The explicit mention of the last two Saite kings leaves no doubt that Udjahorresnet did not hold these offices after the Persian conquest. Only later Cambyses appointed him to the offices of the chief physician, companion, and director of the palace. In this function, Udjahorresnet composed the Egyptian royal titles of the Persian great king and restored later under Darius I, the Egyptian houses of life, that is, the temple libraries. For the other titles mentioned on the Naufo Vaticano, there's no precise evidence as to when Udjahorresnet held them. Udjahorresnet could have been appointed director of the palace only under Cambyses, and officers such as inspector of the council scribes and overseer of the scribes of the great outer hall were presumably acquired only at the end of his career. The title of a simple scribe may indicate that he acquired some offices in the course of his long career. However, it is equally possible that at the time of the erection of the statue, that is under Darius I, he actually held all the mentioned titles except for that of the commander of the royal fleet. Finally, it should be pointed out that in the tomb of Udjahorresnet in Abu Sir, the title Overseer of the Foreigners of the Hau-Nebut is mentioned, amongst other titles, which is not to be found on the Naufo Vaticano. The multitude of titles, some of which appear very contradictory, such as the overseer of the royal ships and the chief physician, and some of which are difficult to grasp in their presumed functions, such as the inspector of the council scribes or overseer of the scribes of the great outer hall, offer much material for discussion. While the actual function behind these titles can only be partially reconstructed, it is nevertheless certain that Udjahorresnet found himself in the best company, for we know a whole series of late Saite officials who held the same offices, even if not at the same time, as may have been the case with Udjahorresnet. We don't have to look all too far, at least spatially speaking, because in the direct proximity to the tomb of Udjahorresnet at Abu Sir is located the tomb of Menech ibn Nekau, or Nekau Menech Ib, who, like Udjahorresnet, had been overseer of the royal cabinet ships and director of the palace, but also overseer of the Chemehu Libyans, among others. The office of the head of the Chemehu Libyans leads further to a cluster of shaft tombs at Saqqara, where the chief physician and overseer of the Chemehu Libyans, Psametic, was buried. In the same cluster of shaft tombs, 2 chiefs of the royal fleet were also buried. Hebu, overseer of the royal Chau ships and overseer of the scribes of the council, and Saf, overseer of the Chau ships again, and overseer of the scribes of the great outer hall, and so on. This means that 2 offices which Udjahorresnet was later to hold had been distributed at one time among 2 admirals, Hebu and Saf, under Amasis. It is striking that the 2 overseers of the royal Chau ships held exclusively civil offices, so their sphere of competence may have been civil navigation or financial administration, as examples from the early Saite period show. The situation is different for the overseers of the royal cabinet ships, Udjahorresnet and Menech ibn Nekau, because cabinet designated ocean-going ships that, for instance, in the victory stele of Amasis, transported troops of Achaemenid, that is, troops of supposedly Greek mercenaries. Udjahorresnet was in turn chief of the foreigners of the Achaemenid, as mentioned in his tomb, while Menech ibn Nekau was chief of the Libyans, that is, troops of Libyan origin. The personal union of an admiral and a commander of Greek mercenaries is already to be found in the case of Hor with the beautiful name Psametic from the time of Psametic II, that is the predecessor of Amasis. Thus, exactly in the time in which Greek mercenaries are attested for the first time by extensive epigraphic sources in Egypt, above all in the context of the Nubian campaign of Psametic II, even though they already played an important role in the consolidation of the Saite dynasty and the expansion into the southern Levant under Psametic I, the founder of the dynasty. In the case of the Admiral Hor, it is also clear that he must have been the commander of a fleet of seagoing warships due to the title overseer of the royal battleships of the watchware, that is the Mediterranean. Pharaoh Amasis, in turn, is known for its extensive diplomatic network with Greek city-states in Asia Minor, but also on the Greek mainland, most notably with Polycrates of Samos, not least to ensure a steady influx with Greek mercenaries who significantly influenced the fortunes of Egypt, but also other states in the Eastern Mediterranean throughout the 26th dynasty. Udjahorresnet, to come back to him, must have played a key role as a commander of seagoing ships and perhaps Greek troops in the maritime policy of Amasis and later Psammetichus III, which was determined by the threat of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and later by the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. This role had to end after the conquest of Egypt under Cambyses. Greeks and Carians residing in Egypt under the Saite kings were partially deported to Babylonia, namely Borsippa, while Egyptian ships were incorporated into the Persian fleet. However, in contrast to many of his peers, especially Saite court officials, such as the well-attested overseers of the antechamber and others, who simply disappeared from the scene along with their offices after the Persian conquest, Udjahorresnet succeeded in having a second career, to put it in the words of Damien Agu-Labordère. Udjahorresnet himself gives the reason that made the second career possible. Cambyses needed him as a chief physician and director of the palace to ensure that the Persian great king could slip into the role of the lord of the two lands, the Egyptian pharaoh. This was apparently the task of the chief physician, who was also responsible for the houses of life and guarded the religious scriptures as vividly described by Udjahorresnet himself. The chief physician was therefore not only a close confidant of the king, but also predestined for higher administrative tasks, as the chief physician Pef Knight shows, who was overseer of the two treasuries, great steward, director of the palace, etc., and was sent in this function by Amasis to Abydos to restore order there, which he describes in detail in the biographical inscription on the now Phoic statue Louvre A93. In this context, it should be emphasized that also Udjahorresnet, as inspector of the council scribes and overseer of the scribes of the Great Outer Hall, perhaps only under Cambyses and Darius, held key positions in the Egyptian administration. For the inspector of the council scribes, Olivier Perdu was able to show that he was a chief of accountant scribes actually. The overseer of the scribes of the Great Outer Hall perhaps presided over royal heralds. This office thus had the same chance to survive the conquest of Egypt by the Persians as offices such as the planner or the chief of the riverlands, which are still attested by papyri in the early Persian period. While the latter had been introduced only under Amasis, presumably in the course of a more comprehensive administrative reform, the revival of titles such as chief physician, inspector of the scribes of the council, and chief of the scribes of the Great Outer Hall goes back further, namely to the time of Psammetichus II, under whom these archaizing titles are attested for the first time due to monuments of officials like Harbes or Pef Imen. The short reign of Psammetichus II, who ruled for only 6 years, was not only characterized by an energetic foreign policy with campaigns against Nubia and perhaps Syria, but also by profound changes in the Egyptian administration. Indeed, a large number of high officials are attested under Psammetic II, who were distinguished, among other things, by the fact that they almost all bore basilophoric second names. Officials who already served under Necho II even changed their second names in favor of his successor, Psammetic II. Some officials, such as the chief of the antechamber Nefer, or the chief lector priest Nacht-Horeb, Nacht, are exceptionally well attested by statues erected in temples in various parts of the country, especially in Sais, Memphis, and in sanctuaries in the Nile Delta. While the statues of Nacht-Horeb, who conducted a whole program of large-scale statues, impressed more by their size than by their original inscriptions, Horia offers a whole series of extraordinary inscriptions that provide unique insights into the relationship between him and the king. The well-attested officials of Psammetic II set a trend that was to continue until the end of the 26th dynasty, as Udjahorresnet vividly shows. From the second half of the Saite period onwards, high officials of the Egyptian administration had their monuments erected mainly in the north of the country, especially at Sais, but also Memphis. At about the same time, a new type of tomb appears, the Memphite shaft tomb, about which we will hear more in a couple of minutes. This trend culminates in the long reign of Amasis. High officials under Amasis now erected their statues mainly in the various sanctuaries in Sais. as shown by the mayor of Saite, Wach Ibre, the already mentioned Menech ibn Nekau, the chief elector priest Henad, and various other examples. The chief of the riverlands, Wach Ibre, even erected a whole program of partially large-scale statues exclusively at Saite. At the same time, officials such as the seal of the king's Psametic Saite, or treasurer, we heard a lot of these officials, overseer of the cavalry Sematawit Nacht Wach Ibrahim, and the overseer of the entrance of the foreign lands of the Great Sea Nacht-Horeb, boast in their biographical inscriptions of their benefactions to various shrines in Saite. The very same officials were often depicted in the so-called Persian costume, as shown by Psametic Saite, Sematawit Nacht, the mayor of Saite, Wach Ibre, already mentioned Pef Tuao Knight, and a number of other officials. While these examples clearly show that this particular kind of costume or robe was an Egyptian innovation of the Saite period, it can actually be traced back to the chief physician Psametic Seneb, a relative of the chief lector priest Nacht-Horeb, from the time, again, of Psameticus II. And to come to an end, Udjahorresnet exactly placed himself in this tradition outlined. On the one hand, with his biographical inscription, in which he basically elaborates his benefactions for the goddess Night at Saite, that we consider today to be an important historical source for the conquest of Egypt by the Persians. And on the other hand, through his visual representation, as it comes down to us, has come down to us through the now Foro Vaticano. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that talk. And with that, I think in terms of time, we're going to move on to our next presentation and learn about some archaeology here. This is a joint presentation by Ketva Smolakova and Ladislav Barash, both of Charles University. Professor Smolakova studied Egyptology and classical archaeology at Charles University, completing her PhD in Egyptology in 1998. And in 2010, she habilitated in Egyptology with a study on the Saite dynasty. Her research interests include Greek settlements in Egypt during the first millennium BCE, prior to the time of Alexander of Macedon, as well as the analysis of Greek and Asia Minor pottery imports found in Egypt and the problems connected with the ancient Egyptian forts and warfare in the first millennium BCE. Since 1993, she has served as a field archaeologist and ceramicist at excavations in Egypt and Sudan, and she is a full-time member of the Czech Institute of Egyptology in Prague and Cairo, where she currently holds a position as a lecturer. And then Professor Ladislav Barash is a member of the Czech Institute of Egyptology and the Faculty of Arts at Charles University in Prague. He is an Egyptologist with long-term experience in archaeological and epigraphical research in Egypt. He focuses on the questions of Egyptian archaeology and history in the first millennium BCE and the related development of ancient Egyptian religious concepts. He also concentrates on the history of Egyptological research in the Czech Republic. Between 2000 and 2004, he was the director of the Czech National Center for Egyptology, a project sponsored by the Czech Ministry of Education, Youth, and Sports. As at the Faculty of Arts, he teaches courses in ancient Egyptian history, archaeology, and religion. He is a member of the Egypt Exploration Society in London and the Czech Society for Oriental Studies. So with that, the floor is both of yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Marisa, for your kind introduction and for having invited Květa Smolakova and me to this excellent opportunity. At first, I shall speak about the tomb of Udjahorresnet at Abu Sir, and then my colleague Květa would follow with a few words about the pottery and especially about the embalmer's deposit that has been found close to the shaft tomb of Udjahorresnet. So the shaft tomb of Udjahorresnet is situated at the western outskirts of the ancient Egyptian necropolis of Abu Sir, very close to the Dynasty 5 pyramids, and at the same time in a rather short distance from the oldest Egyptian pyramid, the pyramid of Netzerichet or Djoser in northern Saqqara. Udjahorresnet seems to be the first who chose this place and started to build his burial structure just about 200 meters far from the Dynasty 5 monument of King Raneferef. Udjahorresnet started his tomb as first in this group. So far, two other large shaft tombs in this group have been excavated, that of the priest Yufa and that of the general Menechip Nekau, already mentioned before. The burial structure of Udjahorresnet is located at the perhaps most prestigious place. So it is the highest place in this part of the necropolis, and as a matter of fact, it has been for the first time mentioned already by the expedition of Karl Richard Lipsius, who unfortunately, or for a reason that we don't know, has dubbed it or numbered it as the pyramid number 27. So why Udjahorresnet choose this special place, we can only guess at. Certainly this place has never been used before for any kind of structure, or at least we haven't found any trace of any activities connected with this place or appearing in this place before the times of Udjahorresnet. There might be several reasons for choosing this place. For example, Mike Stemmers has mentioned that this place or this group is situated on the ancient line connecting perhaps the corners of the Abu Sir Dynasty 5 pyramids with the area of the temple of sun god Re or Atum in Heliopolis. This might be one of the reasons. Certainly, the tomb of Udjahorresnet is situated in a rather prestigious place that was in optical connection with the area of the former lake of Abu Sir. That, or the remains of the lake, can be seen below. And of course, there might be also some purely practical reasons for choosing this place, as the old tombs here were dug in a very thick layer of shale, tafel in Arabic, so it was relatively easily to dug such huge shaft tombs here in this ground, in this material. Some of my colleagues connected the place also with an easy accessibility of ancient monuments that could be very easily reused for building those structures. Certainly, we haven't found any traces of destruction of ancient monuments at Abu Sir, especially during the 26th dynasty or so, during the times of Udjahorresnet. As has been mentioned already before, Udjahorresnet and some other high dignitaries in this group have been connected with Egyptian army. So a cemetery of most perhaps Carian and maybe also Greek mercenaries might have been situated somewhere in the wider area of the Abusir necropolis. So this group of tombs, including the tomb of Udjahorresnet, might have been connected in some or other way with this presumable cemetery of Greek and Carian mercenaries. The superstructure of the tomb is rather enigmatic or has been very badly damaged in later times. So what has remained is an enclosure wall, massive enclosure wall, in some places about 2.5 meters high and 2 meters wide. And in the middle of it, there is a structure that inside has covered the mouth of the main shaft leading directly to the burial chamber of Udjahorresnet. Here, the core masonry of local limestone has been found and some traces of mud brick. Also, perhaps the white limestone might have been used here, but the original shape of this structure is difficult to assess. Some finds might point to the possibility that this structure originally had a shape of a minor temple or structure on a square ground with slightly inclined walls, and the upper part or a roof decorated with caveto cornice, or this piece might come from some other tombs in the vicinity, but most probably it comes directly from the tomb of Udjahorresnet. Also in this tomb, there were found some pieces of the walls ending with a round top shape that might delimit some courtyards, maybe inside the original structure, but it's very difficult to say more about that. The underground part is resembling much the already mentioned tomb of Pakab in Giza. In the center of the structure, there is a major shaft measuring 5.5 meters square and surrounded on all four sides with a narrow and deep trench, exactly like the tomb of Pakab, or like the situation in the tomb of Pakab. The burial chamber has been situated, as usual in this type of tomb, at the bottom of the main shaft. In this case, the ceiling of the vaulted ceiling of the burial chamber is situated some 12 or 40 meters below the ground, and until the very moment of the burial chamber has to be accessed by a small lateral shaft situated outside the enclosure and a horizontal corridor that connected the bottom of the outer lateral shaft with the entrance to the burial chamber proper. The lowermost place, the reach in this tomb of Udjahorresnet, is about 25 meters below the present ground. It's only at the bottom of the shaft that is situated under the horizontal corridor, in the place where the horizontal corridor crosses the peripheral trench. Otherwise, in other places, the bottom of the lateral or peripheral trenches has never been reached because of the safety reasons. So in plan, the small shaft giving access was situated in the east, as rather normal in this kind of tomb, and the horizontal corridor, partly vaulted, led directly to the burial chamber that is orientated west. The head of the sarcophagus, of the inner sarcophagus, headed or was orientated to the west, so west-east. As I mentioned before, part of the horizontal corridor has been vaulted, as here. Part has only flat ceiling, and here is the place where the corridor crosses the peripheral trench. It has been safeguarded by a massive mud brick walls and massive mud brick wall that seem to have been partly destroyed by the last people who have left the tomb after, or the burial chamber, or the substructure of the tomb after the burial. Almost the entire burial chamber is filled with a double sarcophagus, the outer one of white limestone, and the inner one made of basalt, most probably basalt. It might be also greywick, but it's not quite clear, or at least so far. The sarcophagus, the double sarcophagus, has been found closed and sealed, but the later tomb robbers who penetrated the burial chamber maybe at the end of antiquity in the 4th, 5th century AD have made a hole in the sarcophagus, in the outer sarcophagus, and also in the inner one that I will show you later. The decoration of the burial chamber, or the inner sides of the burial chamber, have left been unfinished. All the texts here have been only pre-drawn in black and partly improved in red. So on the western side, that is behind the head of Udjahorresnet, the pyramid text spells 25, 213 and 214 are written, and on the lateral sides, pyramid text spells 25 and the 226, so part of the so-called snake spells and part of the spell 224. The inside of the burial chamber has originally been protected by the usual system of apertures in the ceiling that have been certainly opened after the burial. This is one of the reasons why we think that the burial chamber has really been used for the burial. So this is how it looked from above, from the ceiling and from inside. On the eastern side, above the entrance to the burial chamber, there were found tiny traces of an offering list, relatively simple offering list with only about 30 or 40 items, so relatively very small number compared to other burial chambers of other dignitaries of the same time. So the inner sarcophagus has been partly smashed as well, or the lid of the inner sarcophagus. so that tomb robbers have found their way inside. The lid of the inner sarcophagus was decorated with the usual chapter 72 of the Book of the Dead. And well, for the reasons of safety, the situation or the double sarcophagus has been left in the same shape as we have found it almost or more than 30 years ago. The outer walls, the core masonry of the enclosure wall that has been preserved has been built in a rather haphazard way of fragments and stones of local limestone. Originally, it has been cased with a relatively thin layer of white limestone blocks, only about 50 centimeters thick. That means less than 1 Egyptian cubit. In some places, or in 2 places, in fact, we have found blocks with lines incised in the upper side. So originally it might be a device to sign the axis of the structure. Under 3 of 4 corners, we have found the so-called foundation deposit. Here is one in the Near Eastern corner, or under the Near Eastern corner of the enclosure. Similar ones have been found under the northwestern corner of the enclosure and close to the southwestern corner of the enclosure. Very tiny traces of what might have been a foundation deposit have been found also in the area of the southeastern corner of the enclosure. The foundation deposit consisted of the usual items like pottery of various shapes, as you might see here, and small tablets of various materials like Egyptian faience, wood, stone, alabaster or calcite, and so on. And on some of them, the name of Amasis have been found that clearly shows that this tomb or the building of this structure have been started under this king. As a matter of fact, on the outer side of the enclosure wall, that might be one of the last parts of the tomb to be built, we have found a very small demotic graffiti and very badly or almost illegible demotic graffiti mentioning year 40 or 41 of a king that is not named, but most probably it must be Amasis II. So the building of the structure might have been ended sometimes shortly after 530 BCE. In the tomb and around it, there were found only tiny remnants of the original burial equipment, especially the rather ugly Shabti figures that name Udjahorresnet and his mother, Item Irdis. Interestingly enough, they mentioned only the last, so to say, title of Udjahorresnet, chief physician, sometimes also chief physician of Upper and Lower Egypt. So here's a title that Udjahorresnet has used only under the Persian kings. Also in addition to the Shabtai figures, two small models of the offering trays and some pieces of the so-called magical bricks that maybe have been put in the burial chamber only during the burial ritual. And here I give the word to my colleague Květa Smolarikova, who will continue.
So thank you very much. Well, in order to complete our brief description of the archaeological situation within the large shaft tomb of Udjahorresnet, I would like to turn your attention to the southwest corner, where a rather small shaft with dimensions of about 2.30 by 2.40 meters and about 10 meters deep was discovered. An impressive, but unfortunately very fragmentary, preserved pottery assemblage at the bottom of the shaft was found and comprised mainly large Egyptian storage jars and a rich variety of well-known shaped, abundantly attested throughout numerous cemeteries. Several of them bore the short hieratic or demotic inscriptions with the name of material stored inside, and traces of a thin layer of sticky, creamish remnants of fine linen on the upper part of body. And especially bowls and shallow cups were heavily stained outside and inside. It is little doubt that these vessels show traces of the liquid materials necessary for mummification. These quite rich contents of the shaft as a whole represents all the waste materials that had been used during the costly mummification process and the final burial ceremonies. The phenomenon of embalmers deposits is relatively well known and documented from cemeteries all around Egypt, and represents a highly interesting funerary practice of the ancient Egyptians, when all the unwanted material from embalming was carefully buried in the vicinity of the burial chamber. All these facts clearly demonstrate that the mummy of the high-ranking official Udjahorresnet was indeed buried in his largely unfinished but fully functional monumental tomb sometime after his return from Elam, but in full harmony with ancient Egyptian traditions. So in wider context, he has found his final resting place in the newly founded cemetery at the border of the vast Memphite necropolis, together with his colleagues in arms. Thanks.
So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our last speaker of today's workshop, Annalisa Azzoni. She is an assistant professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures in Vanderbilt University's Divinity School, Graduate Department of Religion, and Religious Studies Department. Dr. Azzoni's teaching interests span from the Hebrew Bible to various West Semitic languages to ancient Near Eastern history, with a particular focus on women and sexuality. An internationally respected specialist of Aramaic, Dr. Azzoni has developed her professional experience in Italy, Israel, and the United States. Her book, The Private Life of Women in Persian Egypt, was published in 2013, and she is currently working on a second book on Aramaic legal texts from the Neo-Assyrian to the Roman Empire. Dr. Azzoni is also involved as the editor of the Aramaic texts in the Persepolis Fortification Archive Project. So, Dr. Azzoni, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank the Purdawood Center and Rahim Shayagan and Marissa Stephen for this invitation, and as well as Melanie Vasmuth for offering this wonderful opportunity for conversation. I think that my paper today shifts gears a little bit from the conversation because, as you know, I'm going to be talking primarily about Aramaic documents. I will try to focus primarily on some issues of identity, which was sparked really from the volume published by Melanie Vasmuth in the conversation about the complex identity of Udjahorresnet. In particularly, I would like to give you a general introduction on the Aramaic documents for those here that are not familiar with the material, and then I'll focus on some particular aspect. So the Aramaic documents came to the attention of Western scholars from early in the 19th century, when many of them were acquired by various travelers and subsequently made their ways into museums and private collections throughout the following century. It was in the last 10 years of the 19th century and the first 10 years of the 20th that most of them ended up through purchases and in some cases excavation in museum in Berlin, Cairo, Brooklyn, London, Paris, and elsewhere. The material itself extends from the 7th century to the 3rd century BCE and embraces a variety of different documents. We have private and official documents, private letters such as the Hermopolis letters, official letters such as the Yedania archive and the Arshama letters, private legal documents such as the Anania and Miftakia archives, and administrative texts such as the account and lists, personal names, and document of other administrative natures. We also have some words of Achikar, the words of Achikar, which is a literary text, and a few others as well. And as I mentioned earlier, also an Aramaic version of the Byzantine inscription. A large trove of these documents belong to the island of Elephantine, and this is where I would like to focus the attention today, particularly also for sake of time. And I will discuss particularly two aspects of identity. On the one hand, the identity labeling or the tags that were given to certain specific group in these documents, but also group interactions in Egypt under Achaemenid rule. And in this way, my talk attempts at a first glimpse of a response to Melanie Vasmuth's last point, which is how did the Persian domination affected the various population as they were interacting. As mentioned earlier, the Elephantine papyri and ostraca document the life of a complex multicultural society in which Jews, even though I will discuss this term later, Arameans, Egyptians, Persians, and other groups coexisted and interacted under the Achaemenid administration. The private legal archive, in particular, reveal a complex society in which different peoples and traditions came in contact and influenced one another in what we would call the veritable melting pot. For a long time, the study of the document from Elephantine have focused primarily on tracing the legal tradition, either that the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian behind them. Various scholars have identified and stressed Akkadian or Egyptian parallel in the legal formula, showing how these texts share elements in this tradition, or in other cases, they have tried to trace independent Aramaic tradition. These documents are also very much of interest to the study of the Hebrew Bible, and very often we find paragraphs in Introduction to the Hebrew Bible describing the Aramaic documents of Elephantine as an example of an idiosyncratic community which worshipped Yahweh alongside other deities, and that had a temple to the god, which at Elephantine was spelled Yahoo. The religion has been the center of much of discussion, among other issues, because the openness to other deities and the propensity of exogamous marriages has created often a lot of conversation with regard to their specific identity. In recent years, the identity and or ethnicity of the Aramaic-speaking members of the military enclave between Elephantine and Aswan has received renewed and very engaging scholarly attention. We are talking here, as the discussion was going earlier, about these mercenaries. This is a group of the mercenaries that we were mentioned before, and in the document we have, as well as many others, Carians, Khwarezmian, and Ionians are mentioned in a variety of documents, etc., etc. Our particular group that I'm interested in are the ones that are called differently as Jews, Arameans, Judean, Judahite, Yehudites, Yahwist, Syrians, and Judeo-Aramean, and I'm sure that I'm probably forgetting some among those. Some of the confusion, as we'll be discussing, is also due to the documents themselves. As Bob Becking and others, I agree that the term Jew or Jewish is anachronistic at this time, and I think at best this should be considered probably proto-Jewish, if we want to use the term. Though among other labels, I think perhaps the Bob Becking's Yehudite works best as a translation of the term Yehudai. Nevertheless, when citing other scholars, I will use the term Jewish or Jewish just as they do in this particular context. The Aramaic documents from Elephantine, as I said, document a variety of very different people writing and speaking Aramaic, but probably alongside other languages, bearing names in a variety of languages with a wide array of theophoric elements, and in private and legal documents and official administrative records, they are labeled by entity or ethnic labels such as Aramean, which I'll discuss as well, Judean, Caspian, Ionian, etc. In secondary literature, language, religion, geographic, and cultural affiliation are used as grounds to their identification, however, not without problems. I think I want to start the conversation about ethnicity with Jen Johnson, who warned already in 1999 about discussing ethnicity in an ancient context, and particularly in Persian Egypt, as one must take great caution in doing so. Jen Johnson argued that quote, for a group to maintain an ethnic identity, its members must continue to validate inclusion rules. Here, cultural features play a part, but there is no simple, rigid one-to-one relationship between ethnic unity and cultural similarities and differences, end quote. She also asked, quote, in which circumstances these inhabitants, let's say, of Egypt labeled themselves, what labels were used, what criteria determine the use of the labels, or are there indications of ethnic mobility, synchronic or diachronic? And did the government or administrative body use these or other ethnic identification to categorize or extend privileges to individual groups? End of quote. And these are the questions that I think are particularly relevant for the conversation today. The attention in her paper is primarily on the Egyptian perspective, but she nevertheless addresses a particular concern about the Aramaic documents from Egypt, and particularly these ethnic labels, which I'm using in quote, and she calls them possible ethnics as identification. Normally, in the legal documents in particular, people are identified by name, patronymic, identity label, place of residence, and the army detachment to which they belonged, as these was mostly members of the military garrison. A notable exception are the Egyptian, perhaps not surprisingly, but nonetheless interesting. One of the official letters mentions the military detachments of the Egyptians, but in the legal documents, they are only listed by name and patronymic and the profession, which I'm assuming is probably the Egyptian custom in this case. In a few instances, the same person, and this is the crux for the identification of this particular population, the same person could be called Aramean or Judean or Judahite in different documents, which has puzzled, as you can imagine, many scholars. Johnson suggests that perhaps Aramean would be used, possibly even by the Persian government, as a generic term used to describe all Aramaic-speaking groups. Porten had already similarly suggested that the label Aramean was connected primarily to the language. Johnson further argued that the term Judean as an informal or social self-descriptive ethnic used only about Jews to distinguish Jewish Aramean from the other Arameans. This was already a movement towards a simply linguistic term that Porten had asked. So she thought there was an umbrella of Aramean under which the Jewish Aramean were a particular category. In 2016, Van der Turn continued this discussion of this particular phenomenon, and he ended up calling the phenomenon, quote, dual ethnic identity of the Jews of the Elephantine. He asked the question, just quote, how Jewish are the Jews that we encounter in the Elephantine papyri? The conversation here, as in most of the literature, particularly focuses on their religion as well as their identity. He suggested, compellingly, I would say, that the label Aramean was administratively related particularly to Aswan Zaini, and it was a military administrative connection due to the proposed that, quote, administratively speaking, all Elephantine Jews serving in the army were Sainians, since they belonged to the Sainian garrison, end quote. He compared this evidence with the evidence with the Caspians, and he points out that they are never labeled Arameans in the document, even though they are registered in the same documents as the others. And they serve in the Sainian garrison and are familiar with the Aramaic language, but they're never labeled as Arameans. That they were considered separate is also confirmed to the fact that they belong to separate detachments. And despite having social and economic interaction, they, for example, never intermarried with Jews and Arameans. As for the Arameans, Van der Turn suggests that Aramai should be understood as the Persians did, thus coming from beyond the river, Avar Nahara, and they should be understood as Syrian rather than Arameans. The Syrian context could explain the presence of deities such as Eshem Betel, Anat Betel, alongside Yahoo in the collection account, or also the oath taken to, for example, Anat Yahoo. Van der Turn therefore answered his original question by stating that the Jews of Elephantine were quote, Syrians with a distinct Jewish identity. Their Jewish identity became more pronounced as the Persian official recognized the Jews as a distinctive community in the empire. The mission of Anania to Egypt, the author of the so-called Passover papyrus that everyone does not mention the Passover, in 1419, signaled the new status of the Elephantine community as suggested by Kotspire in 2002. But the Jews of Elephantine remain Syrian, as is evidenced by the contracts, nor was this Jewish identity something altogether new, according to the witnesses of the ostraca. They lived at a time in which it still was possible to be both Syrian and Jew. The religious exclusivism that was to become a hallmark of later Judaism was still foreigner to Elephantine Jews, quote, end quote. Most recently, also Bob Becking accepted this proposal by van der Toorn, which he described elegant, and suggested that the Yehudites, quote, fundamental attitude of openness made them able to adapt to the local situation and to negotiate to their identity in the multicultural setting of the Persian period Elephantine. At this point, I would like to shift gear. While I think the notion that the possibility that the Elephantine Yehudites may have been Syrian of Israelite and Aramean origin and all coming together, possibly as has been suggested at different time, although since earlier Carrion were mentioned and Fitzpatrick McKilney has suggested interesting connection between Borsippa and the Carians and the Judean in Borsippa, thus making connection between Egypt and Mesopotamia in this context. And I should also add that the recent publication of the documents from Al-Yahudu as well suggest further connection between these various groups across the empire. But an important element of this multicultural setting that I would like to address particularly in this context is the connection between the Syrian, Aramean, Jewish Yehudites with the local Egyptian population. At the official level, I think the animosity between the Yehudite community and the priests of Khnum, resulting in the destruction of the Temple of Yahweh, has been much discussed in the literature. And so I will address it very briefly. Johnson points out there is an us Jews against them Egyptian feeling found repeatedly in the document from the Jewish garrison at Elephantine, which I think is very well stated. Many explanations have been suggested for the destruction of the temple and for this animosity, from religious intolerance by Schaeffer, or even a dispute, which is also documented over a wall, which is also possibly confirmed by the German excavation by Cornelius von Pilgrim. And Fitzpatrick McKilling also argues that this might fit in a much larger context of, quote, Egyptian perception of separatedness of these military communities composed of soldiers of foreign origin, in spite of their presence in Egypt since Saite times, and in spite of other evidence which points to the social integration. So the characterization of mercenaries as infecting the land, for example, in the Stela of Amasis, the vandalizing of the graves of Carian soldiers, and the destruction of the Temple of Yahweh can all be understood in light of this Egyptian suspicion. So while on the official level there seems to be this animosity, at the private level, in the Aramaic document from Elephantine, on the surface, the groups appear to coexist relatively peacefully. Our two major legal archives both record intermarriages between Yehudites and Egyptian. In the Miftachia archive, the woman herself bears a Yahwistic name, as does her father, and so does her possible first husband, whose name is Yezan or Yezania. But since this first marriage ended or never took place, or possibly her husband died, the woman subsequently married the Egyptian Eshor, and the couple had children who also bore Yahwistic names, Marseya and Yedania. Eshor is also called, speaking about double name, this is, I think, the only case in which a person adopts another name. Eshor in later document is also called Nathan, which is a Yahwistic, it's a hypochoristic, but probably of Yahwistic origin. In the Anani archive, the Anani, the man, who is also a servant in the temple of Yahu, marries an Egyptian Tamut, daughter of Pahu, a slave of Meshulam. Prior to the marriage document, the couple had already produced one child, and then had another child who also had Yahwistic name. In all these cases, the children appear to have Yahwistic name, regardless of whether the mother or the father was Egyptian or Yehudai. My analysis across the rest of the material shows also a high incidence of exogamous marriages and a higher number of marriages between Egyptian women, Yehudite or Aramean men, than the number of the vice versa. And also similar example is also present in the letters of Hermopolis. I have suggested that possible the circumstances of this foreign population may be a determining factor of the rashes, given that we are dealing here with soldiers who came or were deported to Egypt and may have well married the local women. Regarding the worship of deity outside of Yahu, much of the discussion by Becking and van der Toorn is primarily focused on Syrian, I'm using a generic term, deities, but the woman Miftachia, when required to take an oath, she swears by the local goddess Saite. And I disagree with those who have suggested that she's simply accommodating, or as Becking states, it is not an act of religion conversion, but rather a peaceful acceptance of others' religious values and the powers of other deities. End of quote. I do not think that this has to be either a conversion or acceptance of the other parties, deity. I think that it's been amply demonstrated that Yahwism at Elephantine is not exclusive, and it did not only include Syro-Phoenician deities, but the local deities as well, as is further demonstrated by the salutation of an ostracon, where a certain Gidel greets his superior Milkia by saying, "I bless you by Yahu and by Chnum." So at this level, it appears that the interaction between the groups is very well integrated. But there is a final important point that I think I want to point out, and that all the slaves attested in the Elephantine archive, as already mentioned by Porten, but is never very much discussed in the literature, all the slaves were actually Egyptians, and then they received the mark on of their owner on their right arm, as is known, for example, in Neo-Babylonian text. As I have also remarked elsewhere, we often discuss the case of Tamut or Tamat, the slave woman who could marry, get her own property, and had the rights to divorce her husband, and was eventually manumitted by her daughter and her owner, with her daughter by her owner. But the story is also countered by that of Tabi, a slave of Miftahia, whose children are divided between Miftahia's sons after Miftahia's death. And as I said earlier, the picture here is very complicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. So I'd like now to ask Dr. Wachsmuth to please give some closing remarks to our workshop.
Yeah, thank you, Marisa, for the opportunity, but also the challenge to present some concluding remarks. So the two, perhaps on a more generic level, things that really struck me and keep striking me is, on the one hand, that however you organize something, there's never enough time for discussion, never. And the other is especially for contexts which are based in a very close cross-regional entanglement. There's still so amazingly much that one can still find out, can see, and can analyze, can discuss about already known and existing evidence by simply looking at it from a different perspective. Certainly, we will never answer many of our questions on the Persian period without additional evidence. Many of the issues obviously remain enigmatic, but I'm fascinated how much additional perspectives and actually even very concrete evidence comes to light every time one looks into more detail in a very, very concise, condensed context, or even a person and contextualizing this. So there's been actually quite some additional focus also coming up, even within that year after the Udjahorresnet workshop and after the Udjahorresnet publication, or even, I think, in the discussion of today. The other thing, which to me is in a way not surprising, but very, very satisfying in a way, is that it became clear in all papers, essentially, how much more nuanced our studies of any ancient evidence, but specifically also of evidence that has more aspects to it than what's typically within the academic training of a single person needs to be dealt with. That the complexity of ancient realities is much higher than we can envision and can glean from the sources, but that we actually can ask at least much more nuanced questions and can open up these issues. And this has been done, in my view, actually in all papers except mine, which kind of was the point of it. So what we had in Uzume's paper was very strongly this, even though very, very fragmentary evidence, but nonetheless very explicit evidence for at least two, potentially even more, either regionally or even cross-regional attitudes and actions, allegiances to different rulers, to the Persian Empire or to Egyptian local rulers, and that we need to find a balance of showcasing both and potentially more sides, but there's actually a lot you can draw even from this very fragmentary evidence. And then with Alexander, this need to go much, much more into individual details, and in a way also with Annalisa's presentation, that there is a certain tendency to look at things on a wider pattern, on a wider systemic level, which is exceedingly important. But as long as we cannot be sure of the individual circumstances, we also have to look at these and very explicitly reanalyze the individual cases and their wider circumstances in order to then maybe create patterns or not, but to really look at first very much details into potential contextualizations. Whether this is in the case of Udjahorresnet himself, who very obviously already before the Persian conquest had this double experience in his habitus of being a member of Egyptian officialdom, but also of having this cross-regional perspective by his experience as a member of, as a major high official in the army, and his Aegean perspective. So that also this third major player of resistance to the Persian army comes into the evidence and into the development and mindset with Udjahorresnet already just as a single person. And yeah, with perhaps as it's kind of more content-wise connected on Annalisa's issue, not only also there, this very important need for individual drafting out of contextualizations, but really the continuous importance to keep questioning which labels are actually over problematized, but also oversimplified by us. So we still haven't solved the issue, neither for the Persian Empire nor for the periods before or after, on how to actually access what is meant by it. But also there, what's really, in my view, exceedingly important and has been clearly showcased also by Annalisa, is this need for keeping open about a huge variety of interpretation, and not of picking the different evidence that we have and assuming that's all the same, but in each case kind of assuming first it might be something different, and if evidence proves no, it's the same image, then to tie them together. And this kind of brings me then to the paper by Kveta Smolarikova and Ladislav Baresh on the tomb, where also the issue really is to have always a double look at the actual evidence, but also on the contextualizing evidence, and to look at it then in detail so that you can really see that it's not enigmatic. The mummy is missing, but you can actually give a very, very dense argument, even not even a fragmentary, but a very dense argument about the actual processes involved in the burial of Udjahorresnet, and how this burial was disturbed then later on and never buried in there at all. So this scope of contextualizing there extremely important. And another issue really interesting to at least discuss then further in relation to Udjahorresnet's dissemination strategies of his image via statues that proved successful of being still known and replaced. And in the 4th century, the question whether this choice of localization was actually potentially also a very deliberate choice, trying to instigate with this possibly temple-like structure a new focus of the necropolis that actually has been then created later on around him, very similar in a way as the Petosiris tomb in Tuna el-Gebel, which is the first in its kind in that area of the necropolis, has also this temple structure and must have been deliberately placed there in order to have the local community and the future community developing there. So I think this is a really, interesting thought of, and also starting point for thinking more on the reception history of Udjahorresnet and his contemporaries, which is something which is started on, but is still heavily missing, I think, in the general discussion of the Achaemenid Empire. And with that, I would like to thank once more, very especially Marisa and Professor Shayagan, and definitely also very, very much all the panelists. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I would have enjoyed to have at least 2 or 3 more hours of discussing, preferably in person, but even online, that would be great. Thank you.